In 416 BC, the city-state of Athens was in a position of apparent stability. The Peace of Nicias, signed in 421 BC, had temporarily ended hostilities with Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. However, Athenian ambitions had not been extinguished. In this context, ambassadors from the city of Segesta, located on the island of Sicily, arrived in Athens. The Segestaeans were seeking help against their rival, Settlement, which was supported by the powerful Syracuse. This request was not merely a local matter. It represented an opportunity for Athens to expand its influence in the Western Mediterranean. Alcibiades, a charismatic young Athenian politician, saw in this situation a unique opportunity. With characteristic eloquence, he argued before the assembly that an expedition to Sicily would not only help Athens' allies, but would also serve to counter the growing power of Syracuse, an ally of Sparta. During the winter of 416 to 415 BC, the Athenian assembly met to discuss the proposal. The discussions were heated. On the one hand, Alcibiades and his followers painted a picture of glory and riches awaiting them in Sicily. On the other, the experienced General Nicias warned about the dangers of such a partnership. A cautious Nicias argued that Athens had barely recovered from the years of war against Sparta, and that an expedition to Sicily would be costly and risky. He pointed to the geographical distance, the lack of knowledge of the terrain, and the possibility that the Syracusans would receive help from their Peloponnesian allies. Despite these warnings, the assembly, influenced by the rhetoric of Alcibiades and the promise of new conquests, voted in favor of the expedition. The decision was made in the spring of 415 BC, and preparations began immediately. The scale of the expedition was impressive. The Athenians assembled a fleet of 134 triremes, warships that were the pride of the Athenian navy. In addition, 5,100 hoplites, heavy infantrymen who formed the core of the land army, were recruited. These were joined by numerous supply ships and auxiliary troops. The logistics of the operation were complicated. Large quantities of food, water, and other supplies were needed to sustain thousands of men during a prolonged campaign in distant lands. Athens' arsenals were working around the clock to equip the fleet and the army. 3 generals were appointed to lead the expedition. Alcibiades, the driving force behind the plan. Nicias, who despite his initial opposition was chosen for his experience. And Lamechus, a commander respected for his bravery on the battlefield. The city buzzed with activity and expectation. Young Athenians were enlisting, attracted by the promise of adventure and riches. Merchants saw opportunities for new markets. Politicians were calculating how this expedition might affect the balance of power in the Greek world. As the date of departure approached, tension in Athens mounted. Sacrifices to the gods multiplied, seeking their favor for the expedition. Soothsayers were frequently consulted, and their predictions were the subject of intense debate. Finally, in June 415 BC, the day of departure arrived. Piraeus, the port of Athens, was crowded. The fleet, with its sails unfurled and its freshly painted hulls, presented an impressive sight. Soldiers were bidding farewell to their families, some with confidence, others with apprehension. No one could foresee at the time what consequences this expedition would have for the future of Athens and the course of the Peloponnesian War. However, the expedition soon faced its first obstacle. Shortly after its departure, Alcibiades, one of the main strategists, was accused of desecrating the Hermes in Athens. The Athenian assembly sent the ship Salamis to bring Alcibiades back and face trial. The charismatic general, fearing for his life, decided to escape. Instead of returning to Athens, he fled to Sparta, leaving Nicias and Lamechus in command of the expedition. This loss of leadership was a severe blow to Athenian morale and strategy. In the late summer of 415 BC, the fleet reached the coast of Sicily. The Athenians established their base at Catania, from where they planned their operations. Initially, they achieved some minor successes, but soon encountered stronger resistance than expected. The winter of 415 to 414 BC was spent preparing for the siege of Syracuse, the most powerful city in Sicily. In the spring of 414 BC, the Athenians began their offensive. They built a fort at Labdalo, on the heights of Epipolae, and began to erect a ring wall around Syracuse. The Syracusans, led by Hermocrates, attempted to counter these actions by building transverse walls to interrupt the Athenian encirclement. In one of these battles, the Athenian general Lamachus died, leaving Nicias as sole commander. Despite these setbacks, the Athenians made some significant advances. By July 414 BC, they had completed much of the southern wall and were making progress in the north. Syracuse appeared to be on the verge of surrender. However, the course of the war changed dramatically with the arrival of the Spartan general Gylippus in August 414 BC. Gylippus revitalized the Syracusan defense and organized effective counterattacks. Under his leadership, the Syracusans built a wall that prevented the Athenians from completing their encirclement. In the autumn of 414 BC, the Syracusans launched a surprise attack on the Athenian fortifications at Epipolae, capturing the fort of Labdalo. This blow forced the Athenians to abandon their siege plans and adopt a defensive posture. Nicias, ill and demoralized, sent letters to Athens requesting reinforcements or permission to withdraw. The Athenian assembly, instead of authorizing the withdrawal, decided to send a second expedition under the command of Demosthenes and Eurymedon. Meanwhile, in the spring of 413 BC, the Syracusans, increasingly confident, decided to engage the Athenians at sea. Although the Athenians were superior in naval tactics, the Syracusans had modified their ships for combat in the confined waters of Syracuse harbor. In a series of naval battles, the Syracusans inflicted significant losses on the Athenian fleet. In July 413 BC, Athenian reinforcements led by Demosthenes and Eurymedon arrived. Demosthenes, recognizing the desperate situation, advocated an immediate withdrawal. However, Nicias resisted, fearing the reaction in Athens. Demosthenes then proposed a night attack on the Syracusan fortifications at Epipolae. This attack, carried out in August 413 BC, ended in disaster for the Athenians. In the confusion of the night, the Athenian troops became disorganized and suffered heavy losses. After this failure, even Nicias accepted the need to retreat. However, a lunar eclipse on August 27, 413 BC was interpreted by the soothsayers as a bad omen, leading Nicias to delay departure for 27 days. This delay proved fatal. The Syracusans, taking advantage of Athenian indecision, blocked the entrance to the large harbor with a line of ships. In September 413 BC, a decisive naval battle took place in the harbor. The Athenian fleet, trapped in the confined space, was completely defeated. With their fleet destroyed, the Athenians had no choice but to attempt an overland retreat. On September 3, 413 BC, the Athenian army began its march, pursued by Syracusan forces and their allies. Exhausted, starving, and demoralized, the Athenians were constantly harassed. On September 7, Demosthenes' forces were surrounded and forced to surrender. 2 days later, on September 9, the troops of Nicias met the same fate near the Aesoneris River. Thousands of Athenian soldiers were slaughtered trying to cross the river. Nicias and Demosthenes were captured and executed, despite the efforts of Gylippus to save them to take them as prisoners to Sparta. The surviving Athenian soldiers were sent to the stone quarries of Syracuse, where many died of starvation and disease. The defeat in Sicily shook the foundations of mighty Athens. In the autumn of 413 BC, when news of the disaster reached the city, shock and disbelief quickly spread among its inhabitants. The Athenians, accustomed to victory and glory, suddenly found themselves facing a brutal and bewildering reality. The loss of life was devastating. Of the more than 40,000 men who left on the expedition, almost none returned. Entire families were left without fathers, brothers, and sons. The streets of Athens, once bustling and full of life, became somber and silent. Mourning gripped the city, and temples filled with citizens seeking solace and answers from the gods. Economically, the blow was equally severe. Athens had invested an astronomical amount of resources in the expedition. The state coffers, once brimming with tribute from the League of Delos, were now virtually empty. The city faced an unprecedented financial crisis. The Athenian fleet, the pride of the city, and the basis of its imperial power had been decimated. Of the 134 triremes that sailed for Sicily, barely a few managed to escape. The loss of these ships and the experienced crews that manned them was a blow from which Athens would never fully recover. By the winter of 413 to 412 BC, the political situation in Athens was chaotic. The leaders who had promoted the expedition were severely criticized. The assembly, divided and demoralized, struggled to find a clear direction. Meanwhile, Athens' enemies saw their opportunity. Sparta, emboldened by the defeat of its rival, intensified its war efforts. In the spring of 412 BC, the Spartans sent aid to Ionian cities that sought to rebel against Athenian rule. Chios, one of Athens' most important allies, was the first to declare its independence, quickly followed by Erythras and Clazomans. In the summer of 412 BC, Alcibiades, the general who had fled to Sparta, convinced the Spartans to fortify Sicily, a strategic position in Attica. This action cut off food supplies to Athens and deprived the city of income from its silver mines in Laurion, further aggravating its economic crisis. Nevertheless, Athens refused to surrender. In the autumn of 412 BC, the city began to rebuild its fleet, using an emergency reserve they had stored on the Acropolis. This effort demonstrated the Athenians' resilience, but it also underscored the gravity of their situation. They were using their last resources in a desperate attempt to maintain their position. The defeat in Sicily marked the beginning of the end for the Athenian Empire. Although the city would continue to fight for nearly a decade more, it never regained the strength and influence it once had. Thank you for watching this video about the Sicilian expedition and its consequences for Athens. Soon, Athens will face new challenges that will test its endurance like never before. Will the city manage to recover from its defeat in Sicily? Athens' fate hangs in the balance as a new storm brews.